Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar organized by ecoDa and EY. Geopolitics, that's the topic of today, and geopolitics matters so much that boards cannot simply delegate it to management. Geopolitics shapes markets, supply chains, technology, and strategy. And boards must change the way they think, because the world of today is not the world in which most board members built their careers. Market dominance alone no longer ensures success. But this raises different questions. Basically, where can board members find the right information? How can boards integrate geopolitical risk into strategic decisions? These are the questions we will explore together today. We have two experts with us, and the conversation will be led by Andrew Hobbs. Andrew is EY EMEA Center for Board Matters leader, and he is also EMEA Public Policy leader. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Beatrice. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all again. We're delighted to partner on these sorts of webcasts with ecoDa. And Beatrice, I think you've set up the discussion very well. I mean, geopolitics, we hear and we know is top of the priority list for boards right now. It's easy, though, to be informed about what's going on. You know, we can all read the newspapers, but actually translating that into insight and then actionable insight is really what we want to concentrate on today. And as you rightly said, we've got two fantastic guests to help us do that today. The first person is my fellow partner, Famke Krummüller. Famke is a partner in our Geostrategy team and is deeply involved in helping boards and companies think through these issues and work out how they can take strategic action. And with her is Jonathan Gelder, who's the Director General of the IOD. I'm sure he's well known to many of you already. Jonathan, again, deeply involved in geopolitical issues and indeed has just returned from China. So we're looking forward to him giving us some, I don't know if war stories is the appropriate analogy, but certainly giving some anecdotes about what he's seeing and hearing there. And that's probably enough for me. I'm not the expert here, so I'm going to hand it over to the two that are. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have a couple of sort of initial presentations by Famke and some reflections by Jonathan, and I'll intervene at some relevant points. We'll have a bit of a discussion and I'll open it up for questions to you as an audience afterwards. And to that end, please do use the Q&A function and we'll get to as many questions as possible. So with that, enough from me. I'm going to turn to Famke, and Famke, just help explain the crazy world in which we find ourselves and how you can start breaking it down for us and others.
Sure, Andrew, thank you very much. And it's a big pleasure to be with you today. I'm happy to try and explain the world to you. It has definitely become much more of a challenge than it used to be in the past, even though, of course, political risk has always existed and has always been an issue for businesses to watch. But clearly, the pace at which this has become an issue and the structural change is quite important. So that's what I want to focus on today. You can see in this graph what I just already described and what I think all of us can feel more or less on an everyday basis, which is the fact that the levels of geopolitical risk have increased quite rapidly and continue to rise. This is the turquoise line that you see here. And we've mapped company event transcripts mentioning geopolitical risks to it just to show to what extent that's varying with it, but that for a really long time there was quite a disconnect there. And I think, to be honest, both based on my everyday conversations with businesses as well as on survey data that I also want to share, we can see that still a lot of businesses are actually struggling to really anticipate political risk and geopolitical developments correctly, and therefore, of course, are in a much more complicated position to actually manage it. I always like to share this data point, which comes from our Geostrategy in Practice survey, which we ran at the beginning of this year, and which I find very impressive because with the more than 1,000 CXOs that we interviewed, almost 80% told us that they had been surprised by more than half of the political risks that had impacted their company in the past year. And of course, there's a lot of uncertainty these days, but that certainly cannot and should not account for 80% being surprised by more than half of the political risk that impacts them. So what am I trying to say here is that political risk is high, is continuing to rise, and businesses are often not in a good as a position as they could be in order to better understand and anticipate what's going on. That is obviously particularly important in a context where political risk do have an impact on companies, and these days it's majority of impacts is negative. This is also what you can see here. I don't think some of this data is surprising, with the most negative and the highest negative impact being on operations and supply chain. But then you can really see when you look at these data points that actually political risk has an impact across different business functions, and none is really spared. And I think that also makes it much more complex. And also this cross-functional impact is often still underestimated. So it's not sufficient if just operations and supply chain, for example, look at it. It really needs to be across the different business functions. And all of this environment that I'm describing is, of course, contributing to the elevated concerns about political risk and its impact on businesses over the next couple of years. And the executives that we asked, they are concerned about all 4 types of political risks that we're looking at, with geopolitical risk specifically, of course, being the highest. And I think that is a fair reflection of the environment in which we currently are. So what is this environment in which we currently are? Back to your question, Andrew. And there's a lot of very rapid change, and I think we're all following the headlines, of course, to a certain extent. But what I think is particularly important is to actually be able to cut through these headlines and understand what stands behind them and what are the structural trends. Because, of course, some of the kind of current affairs and news need businesses to react and to crisis manage, etc. But a lot of it really needs to be understood as structural trends and therefore inform business strategy as a result of that. So the way that I am looking at this is that we're living through a moment of fundamental change to globalization. We've all, I think a majority on this call will probably have lived through a couple of decades of ever advancing and opening globalization, which is essentially what we call the post-Cold War era of globalization, a system that was relatively unipolar, dominated by the United States, in which we therefore, on average, saw much more geopolitical cooperation, and therefore everybody could focus more on the economics rather than on the geopolitics. Now, we've reached an inflection point and have now started to live in a new era of globalization. And there's a lot of uncertainty around what exactly this new era of globalization will look like. I'll come to that in a second by saying something about the different plausible scenarios that we have identified there. But we already know a couple of things. First of all, this era of globalization is going to be much more multipolar. So more actors means it's more complicated. As a result of that, there's more geopolitical conflict. We already see this playing out. Conflict in the broad sense of the term. So this can be actual kind of physical wars, let's say, but it can also be hybrid wars and other types of challenges and attacks. And then as a result of all of this, much bigger focus on security, and also here security in the broad sense of the term. So not just kind of in the sense of defense, but also in the sense of economic security. Much more interventionism by governments in order to secure this economic security environment. So you can see this is really fundamental change. Probably the most important takeaway from this, other than the fact that these are structural trends and they're here to stay, is that, of course, this fundamentally challenges the business model of all these businesses that were built in these decades of advancing globalization. Doesn't mean that nothing is working anymore, but it means that it needs to be questioned and maybe adapted on certain aspects. So where are we going with all of this? I want to share scenario analysis, which is also publicly available. We've just updated it this past month, and it's about the future of globalization. And we look at where do we think can the world plausibly move over the next 5 years. So this is a 5-year time horizon, which already in this environment is quite challenging, I think, but it should allow for businesses to plan. The two fundamental drivers that will determine where this will go is one, foreign policies, the nature of foreign policies. Will countries have rather international and open foreign policies, or will they be rather isolationist and focus on themselves? And then the second driver is economic sovereignty policies. So this is about how much interventionism is there actually going to be into the economy. Is this going to be industrial policy, for example, going to be rather widespread, or is it going to be limited and so not that much interventionism into the economy? Now, when we look at the four plausible worlds that emerge here, the first one is one that we call neoglobalism. This would essentially entail that actors such as, for example, the Europeans, the European Union, together with some emerging markets, start to work together, reform the international institutions for there to be more emerging market representation, engage in new and alternative coalitions and trade relationships, and therefore go into a certain level of revival of this multilateralism and the international alliance system, but one that will look different, and one where in the beginning, certainly over the next couple of years, the US would probably not be part of it and then might rejoin it later on. Even in this world, in various strategic sectors such as technology, we don't think that we're going back to the open world in which we were before, and so that there will be a certain degree of government interventionism there, even though this is the most open environment. The second world is one where we would see, probably to a certain degree, some type of grand bargain between the US and China that say, okay, we all focus just on our regions. As a result of that, the EU also focuses more on its own sphere and region, probably with more internal coherence. And in this more regionalized environment, regional institutions, maybe more regional trade agreements, alternative institutions to the international ones emerge, and therefore trade routes, supply chains, energy grids, data flows, and things like that all become much more regional. Across the regions, there will be flow, especially in the less strategic sectors, but a big focus will be on a much more regionalized world, and obviously supply chains and things like that will mirror that. Then the third plausible scenario is one that we call Cold War II. I think the name to a certain extent speaks for itself. This would be an environment in which we have a functioning transatlantic relationship, and so therefore the US and the EU kind of stick together. And on the other hand, we have China, probably with a reinforced relationship with Russia, for example. And these two form two blocks that are in big geostrategic competition with one another, and where it becomes increasingly difficult, if not impossible, to actually trade across the borders of these blocks. Again, especially in the most advanced sectors such as technology, it will actually be impossible to trade across the border of this block, because we will see export controls and things like that, things that we already see these days. So nothing seriously new, but a more advanced version there. There will be a third group of countries in this world that would try and stay neutral in this environment. Some of these countries, maybe if they have resources, etc., will manage to do that, but there will be increasing pressure on everybody to align to one side or another. And so from a business perspective, this is a world with a lot of disruption of the supply chains that don't go across the borders of these blocks, let's say, and often smaller business environments in which you can actually operate, because part of the world becomes much more difficult, if not impossible, to access. And then the final scenario is one that we call self-reliance. This would essentially happen as a result of countries implementing much more self-oriented foreign policies, let's say. The obvious example is America first, but we've also seen names around that are different names, but the same concept in the EU and in China, for example. And so countries turning inwards, and a lot of economic sovereignty policies, as you can see here, because governments are essentially trying to make sure that supply chains get onshored and that there's as little as possible dependence on other parts of the world. Of course, in certain sectors, that's less realistic, but they will then lead to things like stockpiling mandates and things like that. So a quite disruptive environment. Now, to make this even more complex than what it already is, we don't think that the world will necessarily, everybody at the same time, move into one direction. But what we already observe now is that we will probably see some form of asymmetric globalization, and it will depend mostly on what sector you're in, and it will probably also be geography specific. So you can imagine that the more highly strategic sectors, and this is from a government perspective, strategic, and you can see them listed here, will move much more into the direction of widespread economic sovereignty policy, so a Cold War II or self-reliance environment. And then you can imagine that the less strategic sectors move more towards regionalization, and I would say, if we're lucky, more towards neo-globalism. I say if we're lucky because, of course, that's the environment that is the least disruptive and the best for international business and therefore international growth and innovation, etc. But that's not currently where the policies are pointing us towards. So from a business perspective, what to do with all of this complexity? I guess the main thing is to make sure that there is an understanding of what are these different scenarios and to actually plan across all four of them. Scenario analysis is not designed to predict the future, but it's designed to give broad ideas of what it could look like so that you can plan for them. And as I said, there will be nuance in whether you're in a strategic sector, what geographies you operate in, etc. And then it will be important that different parts of the business feed this into how they think, for example, about their strategy and operating model, about their supply chains, that these are things that are considered when there's asset valuation that's taking place. And in general, think through what is our risk exposure, for example, in a specific scenarios, how prepared are we to deal with that, etc. So let me stop here. I feel like that's already quite a lot, but this is, Andrew, how we look at the world over the next 5 years.
No, thanks a lot, Panka. I mean, I think you've done a fantastic job in trying to point out the signal rather than the noise. And yeah, that was a really helpful explanation. I thought one of the really interesting things for me, I was waiting for you to say it, was I was thinking which scenario do you think is most likely? And I think the way that you explained it, it all depends on the sector. I think is particularly helpful. So just in terms of so you've deciphered the world, you try to make some sense of it. If we look forward, what topics do you think boards should be focused on in the next 12 months and beyond? I mean, you've done this sort of scenario analysis. You've said you've got to look at it across strategy, supply chain, asset valuation, risk and resilience. But what do you think's coming up?
Yeah, obviously, to a certain extent, a lot of this is already currently playing out, and it is important to keep the structural developments in mind. But as I said in the beginning, you of course also need to plan for what's imminent and what's happening over the next couple of months. And what I want to share here, without spending necessarily too much time with it, is our top geopolitical developments for 2026. This is based on analysis that we will share publicly in 2 days. So it's a little preview of how we're looking at this. And you can see here there are essentially three big themes that emerge and through which we look at this lens, at this world that is through which lens we're looking at this world, I was trying to say, throughout the year of 2026. And the first one is about new rules and norms. And so this idea that policymakers will continue to deepen their efforts to direct economic activity, and they will do so in probably three main ways. State interventionism, so to enhance the economic security using different policy tools. It's something that I just talked about. It's one of the big signposts of these different worlds. We think that trade will continue to be under pressure, so trade policy volatility isn't over, and as a result of that, that will have an impact on supply chains, trade patterns, etc. And then the third way in which this will materialize is through sovereign AI and cyber conflicts. Also nothing new, but developments that are expected to continue throughout the next year and therefore be important for businesses to watch. The second big theme is around the geopolitics of scarcity, as we called it, and we highlight three scarce resources relatively broadly defined in this outlook. So the first one is water scarcity, where the challenges are accelerating because we see more geopolitical competition for digital sovereignty, and the growth of the AI industry, for example. Climate change, of course, continues, and so we think that governments will invest more in water infrastructure, but as a result of that, there will be potentially trade-offs across industries, and this is really something that I think probably much more businesses than what they currently think should be thinking about. And the fifth development here is then the critical minerals rush. Of course, a variety of critical minerals are needed for different strategic sectors, such as digital technologies, high-capacity batteries, and defense systems. And so governments will race to gain or retain access to these critical minerals. And then the last development here is about debt, capital, and currencies, and this idea that geopolitical competition and the growing politicization of capital allocation are reshaping the financial system. So there's much to think about there too. And then the third themes, we essentially think about it in terms of spheres of engagement, and this idea that these developments will play out particularly in these regions that we highlight, that we think will be particularly important throughout next year. Of course, North America, so we think policy volatility will continue there, and so this will affect supply chains and investment opportunities. We look at the Asia Pacific, where the fact that their governments focus a lot on economic security may actually create regional economic opportunities. We highlight the fact that Europe is definitely at a crossroads regarding both its national security as well as its economic competitiveness. And then finally, we look at the geopolitical recalibration in the Middle East and what that means for economic competition and opportunities there. So a lot to talk about in the actual outlook. You have the details of how we look at these developments, and then the breakdown of what could this mean for business, for specific sectors, what should be done about this. So it's really a relatively big analysis. I don't want to spend more time with this right now, Andrew, but this is how we look at 2026.
I mean, a great list there. I think the one thing that I sort of highlight on is the point about geopolitics of scarcity, because it feels to me like the risk of scarcity has been talked about for a long time, and now we're getting to a world where it's actually coming home to roost. So that's super interesting, that, and one to watch. Thanks. I'll come back to you in a second. We're going to hear plenty more from you, Famke. Thank you for kicking us off. I'm going to turn to Jonathan now. Jonathan, welcome. Now, if I could I would love to get your reflections, but just to kind of very briefly summarize what Famke's talked about, just so you can reflect on it and see whether it matches what you're seeing and hearing, is geopolitics currently top of the agenda, but despite that, CEOs are surprised by a lot of the risks that they're seeing. It's impacting all parts of the business. We're in a new world, a new multipolar world, a new era of globalization. There are lots of different scenarios, and we don't quite know how it's going to work out, but perhaps the sector play is the way to decipher it. And then in terms of the other topics coming up, new form rules and norms to kind of adjust to that new multipolar world, the scarcity point I just mentioned, and then some spheres of engagement questions in some regions that are certainly top of the news agenda. But yeah, love to get your reflections on that, and particularly from the part of the world that you've just come from.
Yeah, actually, I wasn't in China. I was talking with colleagues in China,
Okay.
but yeah, I mean, I speak to China pretty well every other day. And recently we had a delegation here in the UK from Hong Kong, from the Hong Kong Invest team. And I'll reflect on that in a minute, but just to respond to the kind of key points that Frank has raised, yeah, of course, all are well made and we're feeling them. Whether you are based in the UK, where I happen to be sitting here in London, or if you are in Beijing or Hong Kong or Singapore or wherever you are in the world, or across Europe, then you are going to be feeling sometimes acutely and sometimes tangentially in the real world the things that Frank has been outlining. I wanted to kind of look at it slightly differently because that's a great backdrop to the boardroom complexity. And of course, boards only have literally maybe a day every few months to address these things. And therein lies one of the issues because how do boards, collective groups of human beings coming at the conversation from very different perspectives, often from management, but often from a non-executive perspective, how do they make sense of this and how do they codify it and how do they make it real within their own businesses? And I was just going to touch on a few areas that I think might be helpful for people viewing this webinar. So it's kind of all about risk and the management of risk. And it's something for those people who don't know what the Institute of Directors is. I'll just give you a 10-second update. So basically founded in 1903, got a royal charter from the then king in 1906. We're a bit of an odd animal. We are an educator, so we actually train directors. In our certificate, our diploma, and we're the only people in the world that can award charter status. But we also have a very close connection with the UK government. And I mean UK governments, so we work with the Scottish Government, the Northern Ireland Assembly and the Welsh Senate, as well as Westminster here in the UK. So we're a slightly odd animal in that we do have very close connectivity with the UK government. So we're very well aware of where the reality of the rubber hitting the road from a political perspective affects business. And really just to add to that, the right, I mean, today in the United Kingdom, it was announced that Great British Railways has been set up, been announced with a new livery and all the trains. And that is a great example of how the UK government is essentially bringing back into public ownership previously privately held transportation operations. And that is where the zeitgeist is going in the UK. It's certainly where we're seeing the zeitgeist moving in many other parts of the world as well, to public ownership as opposed to private ownership. We're seeing the balance and shifts in that regard as well in terms of what I would call hybrid governments. We have well tested in Europe hybrid governments, coalitions, and certainly we see the likelihood of those increasing. So at a kind of very micro scale within the United Kingdom, and we've seen this in Holland and elsewhere in Europe, the kind of need for coalition, need for agreement, the need for alignment at a political level. There's plenty of disagreement and precious little alignment, unfortunately, but we are going to see that is going to happen. And that's mainly driven out of another force to be reckoned with, which is public opinion. So public opinion is absolutely kind of set by the media. And the media then, no news is good news, so bad news is good for them. And so we see a higher propensity of coverage to be, if you like, focused and dedicated to the bad things happening in the world. So that doesn't help when you're sitting in a boardroom and you've got the media continuing to tell you that everything's going to hell in a handbasket. And actually, that creates great uncertainty in boardrooms. Because even though you might feel the reality in your business, you have this incoming awareness and perception that things are not great. And we actually, in the UK, in the Institute, we measure that perception every month. And we ask our members very simply a number of questions. But one is, how confident are you in the UK economic position, and how confident are you in your own business? And they are quite different, because business is your business and you can control that. Politics, you can't really control. No matter how much we try to influence, you can't really control where politics goes. And I'm going to expand this out globally in a second. So in the UK, the vast majority of our members, 20,000 of them in the UK, are saying that they have very, very low confidence in the UK government and in the UK economic position. We do it on a sliding scale from plus 100 to minus 100, and last month it was at minus 73. It sat around minus 74, minus 73, minus 72 for the past few months, not helped by the budget in the UK a few weeks ago. And that is the tonality of broadly business, these kind of middle market businesses, Mittelstand in Germany. We represent broadly that middle cohort of businesses in the UK, like the backbone of the UK economy, and they are broadly not very confident right now. They are about 10 points more positive about their own business, and that tends to be where it goes. So when people feel that they have control, and we just talked about the lack of control that is coming down the tracks, then they feel more confident. So what I want to really to talk about is when you look at a global perspective, when you look at, if you go outside the UK, you go outside your own country and look back at it from afar, it's very interesting. And this is something that we do on a regular basis, and I know EY does it in your geopolitical reviews. When you look back at a country, if you are in China, talking to China this morning, you look back at the UK, you still see what I would call brand Britain. You still would see brand Germany. You would still see brand South Africa, because the brand of the country sits behind the corporates that come from that entity, that country. So brand Britain is still sort of seen for red pillar boxes, the crown, green rolling hills, the kind of probity, rule of law. There's some kind of things that you have a perception about brand Britain that run before you when you go into the rest of the world. It's the same for any country. There's a great survey done by WPP that actually you can go and look at about the branding of countries. And I would encourage people to go and think about the where you are coming from has an impact on where you might be going. And that also is about the perception that other organizations sitting in other countries have of the political environment that you are operating in. And that's very important for inward investment as much as it is for going global. So one of the things that kind of underpins all of this, I think, is the notion of crisis. And I don't know if we've all heard of black swan events. I'm not sure if people have heard of grey rhinos. Grey rhinos are a Chinese expression. Xi Jinping came up with this idea of a grey rhino. It's basically a very large, horrible thing that is sitting around all the time that could at any one point turn and hit you. As opposed to a black swan, which flies in, is terrible, and to draw the analogy a little too strongly, then flies away again. So COVID was a black swan event. And governments are now preparing, I know the UK government is now preparing for other pandemics. But that's a known, if you like, to quote or misquote Rumsfeld. It's the unknowns that are the big problem. And that's where I absolutely agree with Franco's point earlier on about scenario planning. And one of the things we advocate in the training we do is about doing that scenario planning to make sure that you're aligned and you understand the potential of risk. I mean, basically, risk is very simply the difference between probability and impact. So if you take Franco's overview, when you look at that, which is beautifully done, I have to say, I really like that. I'll be looking at that later, and then apply your own probability matrix to that, which you should do as a board in terms of looking at your risk management and your risk register, then actually some of those things, quite frankly, go away because they're not relevant to you. So the world might be going to hell in a handbasket, but there is opportunity in crisis. And looking for those opportunities, EY does a lot of work in that area, I know, and I used to work in another organisation, they also do that work. But looking at the opportunity that exists in crisis is not a bad place to start, because the risk might not apply to you. I'll give you an example. So if you are a UK business, or if you're a German business or a Dutch business or a French business, and your primary market is within your country, you're going to be impacted by supply chains, but you're probably not as impacted by the vagrancies of Xi Jinping's circular internal economy in China, but you will be affected by the supply chain aspect. So, that's the thing to watch, rather than, am I going to be worried about the Chinese circular economy and the 5-year plan that's going to come out next year? Probably not. But I am going to be interested in the supply chain, and I am going to be looking to de-risk my supply chain. So my point here is that it can become less complex the more you focus. And that's not to say you shouldn't be aware of the unintended consequences of ignoring something, but it is really important. I'm just going to give you a couple more examples that you pick your poison. You've only got a certain amount of time as a board. That's why you are employed as non-executives. You are employed for your judgment, your insight, and your questioning, your curiosity about the business. We're about to launch the outcome of a commission we've had this year, which is looking at the role of the non-executives. Come out, you look on our website, you'll see this. But that's really asking non-executives be focused on the real things that matter. Not everything. It's impossible to be focused on everything. Your brain will explode. And also you spend an awful lot of money on consultants, bless you all. But it's the key things you want to look at. And I would just draw attention to one area before we maybe open it up, Andrew, to other conversations. And that really is around war and power. War and power. And you've mentioned it tangentially, Franco, in your presentation. War and Power is actually the title of a book by a guy called Dr. Phillips O'Brien. I'd certainly recommend you go and have a look at that book. It's a very powerful expose of the impact of the one key word in that book is around alliances. Allies win wars, and allies give you competitive advantage. And one of the things that we will see over the next few years, and I would actually say 5 years is a long way away. I mean, 18 months is the horizon where a lot of people are working on right now. And indeed, I know for many organizations, it's a 6-month planning cycle because things are moving so quick. But where are your alliances? Where are your partnerships? And this is area where I think de-risking is a lot easier in the ecosystems that you create around you in order to make sure you can defray or defend your position from a competitive advantage perspective. Give an example. Go back to something we were talking earlier on. You alluded, Franco, to NATO. You didn't talk about NATO, but you alluded to NATO. You look at that where alliances, quite frankly, were the main underpinning of the reason why various wars around the world have turned out the way they have done. It's not the impact of the first bomb that wins a war. It's the long-term, scaled-up support from allies that provide, in the moment, that Ukraine can stand where it is because it has the support of allies. And all the news is about the alliances. And I think there's a lot to learn. If you read Sun Tzu, The Art of War, it's a good example. Making sure that your alliances are set up so you can help manage some of the risks that Franco was talking about. That's quite provocative, but I would really encourage boards to think about alliances. Really encourage boards to think about where are your supply chain alliances? Where can the risk be deferred, defrayed, or minimized by either accepting that it's so low risk you're actually not going to spend time on it, or looking for ways you can defer it or defray it by seeking alliances. And sometimes they will come from unexpected sources. So being creative is one of the other components of a good board when challenging management, quite frankly, to take a different perspective. And I'd be very interested, frankly, in your view about that, because we're talking here about the whole business, but the whole business is run by boards. Whether it be unitary board in the UK or whether it be the dual boards we see elsewhere around the world. But nevertheless, there are people that are accountable for the direction strategy of business. And this is on the boardroom agenda, and it should be on the boardroom agenda. And I would sit it under risk. It's not in the risk management department, it's at the board level. But food for thought, Andrew.
Very good, thanks. They went a lot of content in there. If I sort of a couple of reflections, I love that point about collaboration at the end that you made. It reminds me of the phrase, a problem shared is a problem halved. But if I then turn it back to Famke, I mean, I think Mike made, Jonathan made a couple of really important points there. You know, boards overloaded, political and policy uncertainty can lead to inaction. and then started talking about, how do you focus and zero in and try and sort of say, well, not realize that not everything affects me as a company, and actually I'm only affected by some very specific risks, and then that gives you a bit more confidence to take some action. But Famke, you've done a lot of work on what good looks like. So we hear that term geopolitics is now in this sort of the natural conversation. We're now hearing terms like geostrategy or geostrategist. What does a good geostrategist look like? So how can boards be good at this?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Jonathan, as well for your insights. Many things where I can react to. I mean, I think the one thing that I would just want to kind of pick up to continue the conversation is that you said you can't control the politics. And of course you can't. I mean, you can have a public affairs strategy, that's something. But what I really do like to always emphasize is, but you can manage political risk. And so I feel like a lot of businesses, because this is maybe so new and complex, etc., just go like, oh my God, okay, I'm totally kind of can't control this. I'm totally just subject to this. And it's not, that's definitely not how I would look at it. And so maybe that's the encouraging point of today is no, you can actually do many things about it and probably much more. If you're the average business, you can probably do much more about it than what you have already done. So while you were talking, Jonathan, I was just going into the slides that I have to add one that I want to share, which is kind of going back to what you say. You need to focus on what actually matters to you to cut through this noise. And we've done a lot of work on how to become a geostrategist and have developed a whole methodology behind this. We actually published this in a book, which is what you can see here. And in the book, we also talk about what is the framework, the methodological framework that you can use to think this through. And we think about it as the geostrategy framework. And Jonathan, you mentioned it as well. After you've scanned for the developments that are important and that have a high probability of happening, so you already put some prioritization there because you put a likelihood assessment on them, then this is the second step here. You really need to focus on what actually matters to your business, and what is every morning in the headlines might actually not be the most important thing that you need to be watching. And on the contrary, it might not be in the headline, but it might be kind of business destroying for you if you don't look at it, to make two very extreme points. But then you really need to focus on how could this impact us and how big is the impact, and then you've got probability times impact, you've got your natural prioritization, and then you go into, when we look at it through two aspects, you go into management. This is the management of risks. You need to make sure that you're prepared for the risk that you have just identified, that your ERM systems work, etc., etc. But then also very, very important, it needs to flow into your strategy and everything that the business is doing from a more strategic perspective. And that's also where the more longer term structural trends then start to matter, so that you can have time now to prepare, because as we all know, changing a supply chain, changing the IT systems or whatever, it just takes a couple of years. Actually, you can't just go like, oh, I just realized today because it's front page and therefore too late that I need to do something about this. And then maybe also, especially from a board perspective, I think what's also important is this highlight that you see at the bottom here, which is the emphasis on govern. So there needs to be internal governance around this at businesses. There's many ways in which businesses can structure their internal governance around this. We have found in our research that there's not necessarily one way that is the right way, so it will depend. But what we do think is that there are a couple of fundamentals that are important. You need ownership for the issue, and that's in a lot of businesses not the case. So kind of everybody has an opinion, but when it comes to it and you need to make actual decisions, it's nobody's responsibility at the end of the day. And then you need communication, because a lot of businesses have access to relevant information, but it doesn't get communicated to the right people, committees, etc. And then you need trust to make sure that the people who are in charge are actually enabled to do their job in this field. Sounds quite basic, often is not happening, and I think this governance aspect is super important. So that kind of is the methodological consultant reflection of also, Jonathan, what you just said. So fully agreed there. The other thing I quickly wanted to highlight as well is that we have seen that boards are doing much more on geostrategy. We've compared the data that we had from 2021 survey to beginning of this year, 2020-25, and you can see there's a rapid change and quite important change in terms of what boards are doing. It also gives you an idea of all the different things that can be done from a board perspective. But when I look at the one that is still the least is scenario planning. I feel like in this environment, scenario planning probably needs to be higher on the agenda. And the other thing that I find very interesting in this data is the fact that only 32% of boards actually have the issue on their agenda frequently, which is defined here as quarterly, which, to be honest, in the current world, quarterly could still be kind of an eternity. So I think there's some margin there as well. Looking at geopolitics once a year in the boardroom feels a little low to me in this current environment, I have to say. So that's something else that I just quickly wanted to highlight. And now finally, to actually answer Andrew's question around what can geostrategists, as we call them, actually do. And so geostrategists, we have it defined. This is kind of based on research where we look at data from survey as well as from businesses, supply chains, and exposure to geopolitical risk, etc. And the ones that are performing better on average are the ones that are doing a certain number of things and doing them better. And so the conclusion from all of this is that these are the 5 things that successful geostrategists are doing much more and much better than businesses that are not as advanced in this space. And so again, I will repeat what I just said. A lot of this will sound very obvious, but I can tell you, I think it's worth double checking how much of it is actually happening, because I'm still surprised almost on a daily basis when I talk to businesses about what is not yet being done. So first one, adapt supply chains to geopolitical realities. It's been going on for some years. It's a structural trend. It's here to stay. The trade tariffs, a lot of them are here to stay. So it's not about crisis management anymore. It's about thinking through where are the supply chains. A lot of the dynamics that I described in the scenarios require supply chain adaptation. Then building political risk into investment decisions. So this is something that should just be done as a routine. You look at the financials, you look at the politics of your investment decisions. Prepare for the unexpected. In this environment, I said you can prepare for many things. There will still be something left that will have been unexpected. The famous black swans, even though when you can anticipate, they're actually not black swans anymore. What do you do about this? Scenario analysis, tabletop exercises are a good thing to do. Then you can see regularly engage the board on geostrategy as one of the good practices, because of course, as the one who has the oversight, getting a mandate from the board can be really powerful in this space because it trickles down across the entire business. And then I mentioned it, determine who has a seat at the geostrategy table and who needs one. So get the internal governance straight around this. This is almost ideally step 1, and then everything else kind of comes from it. So this is what I wanted to highlight. Back to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Pam. I'm going to ask Jonathan some reflections here, but just I think that distills it excellently in terms of those good behaviours. Just a couple of reflections from me on that. Building political risk analysis into investment decisions. I was really impressed by, I think, the stat you've got that says that organisations that do that were 32% more likely to execute on transactions. So they were actually likely to do things. So it gives them confidence. And then they kind of move away from kind of having siloed approaches to this by sort of public policy or someone or risk or general counsel's office, and having a much multidisciplinary team that's looking at it, which completely goes to your point you made right at the beginning about this affecting all parts of the business. Jonathan, reflections from you. Does that still kind of what you're seeing, or any surprises in what Famke's just mentioned?
Yes, chimes what we're saying, and no surprises, as Franca said. Yeah, unfortunately, this appears to be very simple. The problem is doing it. And I don't know if you can take this slide down, Franca, but the thing for us really is it's the doing it bit. Strategy is nothing without execution. So making sure that you have the right structures, the governance and responsibilities is going to be critical. Also, inevitably, you kind of painted a picture that if you are a global business with or a large business, it becomes slightly easier because you have the capacity as well as the capability within the business. If you shrink that down to the vast majority of middle market corporates across the world, they don't have access to that capability within the business. They will have to go outside all too often, and the bandwidth becomes a problem. So that's one of the things we do see is that there's an expression: the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And people can see these are problems that they need to address, but they just don't have the bandwidth. Example is cybersecurity. Everybody's all over cyber at the moment, and that can eat, as Franco said, 2 years of time and a couple of $1 million without even trying. And for a lot of mid-market corporates, that's all they have. They may not have more than a couple of $1 million. So choosing what risk to go after and prioritizing it, and putting it into a time frame, and accepting some of the risk you can't manage because you can't afford to, or you don't have the capability or capacity, is also the role of the board. And I would really encourage people to think in those terms. And the good news is that this is possible. It's one of the things we teach on our work. And recently, we've just partnered with St Andrews University in the UK, and Professor Philip O'Brien, who I mentioned earlier on with the book War and Power, is one of our speakers on that, one of our lecturers on that. It happens every year. We do a whole series of courses about governance and how to actually operate the risk framework within a board. ecoDa.com, go and look at the courses. Really encourage people. There is an answer, and it is about training. It is about getting the right skills, and it is about using the right resources. And without giving EY too much of a plug, it is sometimes you have to go outside. Because you will not have the capability or the capacity inside. And sometimes it is worth going and getting that perspective, even though it might just scare you witless, at least you know. And this is to Franco's point earlier on, there are things that won't be in the news right now, but are coming down the tracks. Just give you a few examples in the UK. One of the things in the UK we do is look at Europe. And that's not because we had Brexit. People have different opinions about Brexit, but basically Europe is very important to the UK. Politically, it's a nightmare, but it's important to business. So what is going to happen in Europe in the next 5 years is going to affect, the next few months at this rate, is going to affect the UK on a time-lag basis. That will be the case if you look at China, if you look at the US, wherever you are in the world and you look outside, there will be things coming down the tracks that you are going to need to think about from a geopolitical perspective, just from a supply chain alone perspective, and whether you're onshore or whether you're offshore or whether you reshore, whatever the expression is, that's a matter for you. But sometimes you do need that extra dimension, and certainly it's something we've seen a lot of businesses are doing now. They are prioritizing getting help, and there's nothing wrong with getting help. There's no sense of weakness or failure to go and ask people who know better than you do to help you address the risks in your business. And to Franco's point as well earlier on, this is sectoral. Just coming off the phone this morning to China, there's been a new survey launched in China this morning, China time, looking at happens to be the British Chamber in China, looking at geopolitical risk for British businesses in relation to the changes in China. Everybody's talking about it, and you do need to get that input. But I would again encourage people to do your risk matrix, assess the balance of probability, and look for the unknown unknowns. And sometimes you need to go and get help, and sometimes you might need a bit of training. Of course, we're delighted to offer that. But there's a lot of free stuff out there as well. A lot of organisations, be the chambers, are very good at providing resources. The free stuff on the EY website also very useful. But unless you are aware, unless you're thinking about it even a little bit, there's a great danger that swan is going to fly in and be very unpleasant, or you'll be charged down by a grey rhino. So I think it really is important that you just have some degree of preparation and you spend some time in it. And I agree, Franco, once a quarter is not enough. But that's often the only cadence of board meetings. So it's really incumbent on management to make sure that they're briefing the board well in advance, ready with the data, ready with the clear, concise presentation material and the evidence to suggest to the board that actually the direction of travel needs to shift a little in order to be ready for the changes that are likely to come. And it's the likelihood then that is the clever bit. And that's probably where people need to get some advance to at least narrow down that likelihood percentage. If it's a very low percentage, yeah, you're going to have to probably accept it's not something you can deal with. But those where the probabilities starting to rise, even though it might seem a long way off, it's really worth at least having some form of plan. It's going to come down to the going concern work around the audit as well, because that's going to be important. You're going to have to prove to the auditors that you're a going concern, you have a plan for risk, and that's scenarios and those stress tests that you will have to do to satisfy the auditors of your going concern position. And we're coming up to the year end. 31st of December is the year end for a lot of organisations. So this is going to be really real in the next few months for boards and finance functions. And don't let the finance function run away with just the numbers. Let's look at the risk associated with those numbers as well. But I'm sure, I know we haven't got much time, but it's a really interesting topic, and it's a pleasure to be able to contribute a little, Andrew, today.
Well, thanks, Jonathan. I think maybe we could agree with Beatrice that we'll do another one another time to delve into some very kind of specific topics that we're not going to have time to get into. But I thought you made some really great points, rightly pointing out that resources are limited in many businesses generally, but also in relation to this agenda. I thought you also made a great point about, I imagine many of your members will be in businesses that are members of various organisations, and perhaps being a bit more demanding of their trade bodies about the support that they need in return for the fees that they pay. Maybe a good thing to do to help with a sort of a sector look in terms of scenarios. I did encourage questions from the audience. We've had one, and I think Jonathan, as you haven't as much perhaps our term as Spamker, I'll start off on with you. Gregor Otimek has said whether he thinks there are possibilities for companies to influence politics so it moves in a more desirable direction. So this is a form of risk management by seeking to mitigate it by influencing. Have you got any comments about that? I mean, your point about alliances is practically.
Yeah, I would do, because we are unusual in the UK in that we do have very close connections with the UK government, and we believe we do have an influence on the UK government in relation to an approach which is evidence-based. I'm from the north of England, from Yorkshire, and we have an expression, don't whinge, don't whine, provide evidence, and evidence backed up with sound argument is a way actually to change the political zeitgeist. And it is something that we do an awful lot of. So actually, public affairs, very, very important. It depends where you are and which country you are as to how you can be impactful. In the UK, it is through the main 5 representative bodies for business: CBI for big, Federation of Small Business for small. The chambers are very effective all the way around the world. And in the UK, we also have a representative group for manufacturing, Make UK, and the IOD basically is the other of the 5. And we are every week, and in fact, I'm there tomorrow morning and then tomorrow evening in Westminster talking to government. So, and it is very important that you use your trade bodies. They're all pretty influential, as you say. They've all got good resources. And if you're not in a trade body, join one. They are actually your voice, and they do have more credibility, actually, often, unless you're super big, where you have leverage from jobs, to be brutal, and investment in a country. But they are very effective at changing government opinion because they do it on the basis of evidence. They're not saying, I'm from X business and we want you to do Y. They can do it, Chinese expression, never kill a man with your own knife. It is very much about making sure that you use the power that you get from other organisations who can speak on behalf of a sector to get sectoral change to the advantage of your own business, but also the advantage of, if you like, in public interest. So it is possible. It is, for some organisations, a very large sum of money they have to pay. In others, it's being part of an organisation, such as the Chambers in particular, in many parts of the world, or the IOD, or whatever. You pick your poison. To voice your opinion along with others that are probably it's like a school, isn't it? You think, oh, I don't want to ask that question. I'm the only one. Actually, if you ask that question, everybody else in the classroom goes, thank goodness you asked that question. I didn't know. So it's the same with government. You will find that the question you're raising with your trade body is probably the same question that most of the people are also wanting raised.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. We've completely run out of time, and I'm going to hand back to Beatrice. But I just want to say thank you to you both. As I hope the audience has seen, it's an incredibly complex topic that can be simplified. But I hope you've heard some actions from us in terms of where you might start. So, Beatrice, with that, back to you. Thanks very much.
What a fascinating webinar. A lot of food for thought, and many thanks to our expert, Femke, Jonathan, and you, Andrew. The webinar has been recorded, so the participants will have the opportunity to watch it again if they wish. And we will be sharing, of course, the publication that Femke mentioned. And it's all clear to us now that board members must be fluent in geopolitics to navigate the world effectively. Board education, as it was highlighted by Jonathan, must evolve to support this approach and help board members embrace systematic thinking. Our member institutes, you can be sure, are already working on this, so feel free to turn to them if you need extra support. But for now, I wish you a very nice day. Thank you very much.